Good morning. This is Crystal with Seasons in the Vine, and it's Fresh Friday. And we're going to be in Esther 2 today. And there are two things I want you to keep in mind as we're going through this. The first is providence, the providence of God, when God intervenes on behalf of his own will and purposes into the lives of humans, into things that are going on in the earth, all to accomplish what he desires. And it's really apart from anything we bring to the table. God moves in his providence. And we see that so clearly in the story of Esther. And the second thing I want you to keep in mind today is another P, is preparation. We're going to see in chapter 2 that Esther is led into a season of preparation, but how often does God in our own lives prepare us for the things ahead, whether we know it or not? The idea is that we would become more aware of how he is providing for us a season of preparation, how he is in his providence moving on our behalf, whether we know it or not. We want to become a people who are very aware of what our God is doing right now in the earth, in our lives, how he wants to use us. And so I want you to be thinking about preparation and providence as we look through chapter 2, and then we're going to bring it home with an application at the end. Okay? So, chapter 2 of Esther. After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Now, you might think it's odd that he's remembering. I'm going to help explain that in a minute, but some time has gone by. Then the king's young men who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king. And let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa, the citadel, under custody of Hegai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women. Let their cosmetics be given to them. And let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This pleased the king, so he did it. All right, so this is the decree. This is what's beginning to happen. Well, one thing I want you to notice just briefly about King Ahasuerus or Xerxes' leadership is he definitely relies a lot on his advisors. He is surrounded by people and he takes a lot of their wisdom to hand. Now, it's kind of interesting because you're like, how could he forget that he did that to Vashti's? But there's been some time, it seems, that has passed. So the gathering referred to in chapter 1 is mostly linked to this gathering that would have taken place that would have been involving preparation for the battle against Greece, the Greek campaign, if you will. That particular campaign launched in the spring of 481 BC, which was Xerxes' 5th year. For over 2 years, he was engaged in the West as the Greeks and the Persians fought. In the fall of 480 BC, Xerxes left Greece and wintered in Sardis on the west coast of Asia Minor. He didn't return to Susa, which is where this is taking place, until the fall of 479. So it's thought, perhaps, we don't know for sure, but perhaps it was that first winter that he was in Sardis that this plan was formulated. And then throughout the next year of preparation, Esther is getting ready along with all the other women to when he's actually in Susa. We're just not sure. But that's pretty reasonable. There's a lot of historical accuracy to these dates. We do know when the Greek campaign was. We know the result of those things. So we're pretty good about that one. All right, now verse 2, other sources confirm, see, once again, just outside the Bible, there are lots of other sources that confirm what's in the Bible, that the king had a harem in Susa and that women were constantly being brought into the Persian harem to replace the older women. So this is just part of their lifestyle, definitely not of God, definitely not something he would desire. But we even see that with Old Testament kings, the idea of concubines and other things. So it's a product of the fallen world, but not just because it's in the Bible doesn't mean it's stamped by God as something that he would consider appropriate. It was the way of the world. Verse 3, life in the royal harem had its advantages and disadvantages. Women enjoyed every sort of material, lavish comfort and were indulgently pampered in many ways. But what was missing in that lifestyle? Well, a real family of their own, a husband that was dedicated just to them, maybe children, all of those things that a woman could hold dear. This is not given to the ladies in the harem. And so they would have not had that. Lots of other advantages as far as in the beauty area and being treated a certain way, but having an intimate family setting, being able to raise children and have a husband, one husband devoted to you, not something they would get to participate in. Okay, let's see where I left off. Okay, let's pick up at verse 5. Now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjaminite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away with Jeconiah. I'm going to say his name differently in a minute. King of Judah, because the Hebrew is saying his name differently. So we'll get to that. Whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she was she had neither a father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her in as his own daughter. Okay, so let's take a brief look at this. So we have mentioned here in verse 5 that we can go all the way back here to see Mordecai has some history. He's in the line of Benjamin. So is King Saul. And that we see in the Old Testament a little bit earlier in this, the first king of Israel. And we're not sure how the relation works out, but it's probable they could have been in the same lineage because there's just some familiar names. However, what we need to pull out from this is there's been considerable decades past. So this can't possibly be saying Mordecai himself was brought from Judah into Babylon. It had to be one of those ancestors listed or a grandfather or whatnot. Let me show you how I know that. Chapter 2 is taking place in 479 to 478 BC. The exile of Jehoiakim, or Jehoiachin, I've heard, under Nebuchadnezzar, that's that king I said I was going to give you the other name, took place in 596 BC. Woo! So that's a long time, 120 years earlier. So for this reason, we can assume that it's not Mordecai himself that was taken into Babylon. He would just be too old. He'd be dead. But rather one of his ancestors listed. That's why we have that little list there. Okay, Mordecai, you need to know, is a Babylonian name. So he's carrying a Babylonian name. I don't know if you knew that, like, even when Daniel went, he had a different name. They would change the names, the Hebrew names, into names of their own language. So Mordecai was taken from their god Marduk. Esther, his cousin, was also a Benjaminite, same family. And the name Esther is Persian, and it means star. And her Hebrew name, which we see listed here, Hadassah, it means myrtle. Now, this is really cool. Myrtle is a plant. And in the Bible, this typically means the recovery or the establishment of God's promises. So isn't it interesting that God's promise to maintain his covenant people all the way through to when there's a Savior and beyond, that promise is being recovered, if you will, or established again or being remembered through Esther, whose name means myrtle in Hebrew. So Hadassah, isn't that interesting? Because we see the promise of God saving his people through this woman. All right, let's read the next set of verses. Verse 8, so when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa, the citadel, in custody of Hegai, Esther also was taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Hegai, who was charged with the women. And the young woman pleased him and won his favor. Wow. So we see the favor of God. We see favor upon Esther's life right from the beginning. He quickly provided with her cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. And Esther had not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to have it made known. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. And so we can see there right at the end, Mordecai really loves Esther. He's caring deeply for her, and he's staying close so that he can make sure that she's doing okay in this situation. Now, the other thing I want to draw your attention to is we don't see Esther denying the food. When we see some of the other people coming out of Judah, I mean, a lot of time has passed. So this is when you're going to see more of that assimilation into the Persian culture at this point. But like when Daniel first went, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and, you know, those particular people, like they really stood against what was considered normal in Babylon. But now all the way into Esther's time, different kingdom now, Persia has taken over. What we see here is there's not a staunch obedience to the law. There's not a staunch obedience to the code, to the culture of Judaism. They're actually keeping it quiet. Whereas Daniel was willing to die for that. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego willing to die for that, but things are different now. So I just want you to notice that. But does that keep God from keeping his covenant promise to this people? Nope. It doesn't. And that's where you see his providence. We don't even see Esther being overtly obedient at this point in time, but still God has raised her into a position to actually use her to save her people. And she's moved into the position, get this, before the need or the threat is even established, because God knows what's coming. So when you have something going on, just a little bit of that application, begin to think like, could this be preparation? How do I need to be seeing what's happening right now? Even if it looks like a problem or something I don't understand, because God knows what's coming. So could this be preparation for something else? All right, let's keep reading. Verse 12, now when the turn came for each young woman to go into King Ahasuerus, after being 12 months under the regulations for the women, since this was the regular period of their beautifying, 6 months with oil of myrrh, that's what they had to do, and then 6 months with spices and ointments for women. When the young woman went into the king in this way, she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening, she would go in, and in the morning, she would return to the second harem in custody of Shahashgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. So a little bit different. Once they're not virgins anymore, they're not in the harem, they're over with the concubines. So a different eunuch in charge of that group. And this woman would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her and she was summoned by name. Wow. So let's take a peek at what this whole passage is talking about. Okay, so concubines were girls who came into a marriage without a dowry. There was nothing really their family was able to offer for them. They had not been taken into the harem with any connections of a political alliance, something that would actually promote them into a different position. So they can't offer any gain politically. They can't offer any wealth or any additional crown. And so that's why they were concubines. As a concubine, they would continue to be supported as a member of the royal household, but unlikely enjoyed any time with the king in the future. Super unlikely that a woman would be called back into the king. Now, what is happening during this time with the king in the evening? Well, this would be that sexual relation part. So we can just see that after that encounter happens and the woman has been taken advantage of in that way, she's put aside, or if she has caught the king's favor or attention, she may be called for more nights with the king. This whole situation, not great. All right, but like it was the world. It is a fallen world. What we see is not how God intended things to be. It's just what happens when we have lived in sin and the world is still broken. All right, verse 15, when the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter, to go to the king, she asked for nothing except what Hegai, the king's eunuch, who had charge of the women, advised. So we can see her respectfully taking the wisdom of someone who knows better, and that's very humble. Now, Esther was winning favor in all the eyes who saw her. So everybody who's looking at Esther is seeing that she is favored. They are looking upon her with favor. We can see this is the hand of God on her life. And when Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, this is how we can figure everything out timeline-wise, the king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins. So he set the royal crown on her head, turn my page here, and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great feast for all the officials and servants. It was Esther's feast. He also granted a remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with royal generosity. So this is amazing. We just see a general celebration at this union coming to pass where there's less taxes and these gifts are given out so that even the poor in the area can still celebrate and experience this joyous time. Let me check my notes. I think we're good there. All right, let's keep going. Now, when the virgins were gathered together the second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not made known her kindred or her people, as Mordecai had commanded her, for Esther obeyed Mordecai, just as when she was brought up by him. In those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And when this came to knowledge of Mordecai, he told it to Queen Esther. And Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. And when the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. Okay, so let's bring this message home. What does all that mean? Well, first we can talk about there's been excavations at Susa that have identified a monumental gatehouse about 100 yards east of the main palace here. The passageway through the gate was about 50 feet long, and 4 towers graced the outside of the structure, and 4 pillars about 40 feet high each decorated the 12,000 square foot chamber through the passageway entering the palace complex. Wow. So we're talking about massive structure here and immense beauty. An inscription ordered by Xerxes or Ahasuerus at the gate identifies it as having been built by his father, Darius. And we can just go up the historic line and see when Darius was ruling. All right, now we hear something about these gallows, and that's really interesting because we immediately think of like someone being hung, but that's not actually what was happening in this time. And it's very vague in the Hebrew to interpret it adequately, but all we can get from the Hebrew is that it's some kind of wooden object. But we can compare it from what we know about Persian practices of this time. And it likely does not actually refer to an execution, a means of execution, as in someone would die on them. Instead, it is generally agreed that this reflects the practice of impaling the corpse of the executed victim, so somebody that's already been killed and executed, with a pointed stake in public view. So the body itself is impaled and then hung on this wooden spike, essentially. The victim was denied, though, proper burial, and birds and insects devoured the remains. Hanging is just something that we can't find. It's not common in as far as a form of execution in the ancient world. If a form of execution is intended here, it would most likely be crucifixion. Isn't that interesting? That's just what the Persian practices could show us. But even in that case, it would be someone that was crucified after they died. It wouldn't be how the actual execution occurred. Okay. I think that's everything. And that information was given by the historian Herodotus. All right, so where does that bring us today? Whew, lots of history there. So application, season of preparation. Esther came into this position with what she had. She just had herself. And she can't even take the credit. God made her the way. So if she was favorable to look at, that was all God's doing anyway. And then, though, she came into it a certain way and then went through a time of preparation. And so to me, I was talking to the Lord about this morning, and I'm like, what does that mean beyond how important we know it is for Esther? But the idea of what can we even take away today? Well, let's just come to the Lord with what we have. Sometimes we wait and we wait and we wait because we think we need to have X, Y, and Z in order. Just go to the Lord and start submitting to him and his will and see what he does out of that. You know, the loaves and the fishes. You don't need as much as you think you need, because then he gets all the credit for supernaturally doing an amazing thing through you that you know full well is never possible in and of yourself. So Esther came as she was, but then submitted into a way that gained her favor to a process and being prepared. So how has God prepared you for the things that you're now walking in? Can you look back on your life and see his hand, see his preparation for what you're doing right now? And then the second question is, how is he preparing you now for something to come, for whatever is in the future that he already knows about? You know, he's predestined us to walk in these good works. And so he has them already planned out for us. But sometimes, oftentimes, we need preparation. We need to grow in steadfastness, perseverance, endurance, just being faithful to get up each day and still seek the Lord no matter what is going on. So I've been going through definitely one of those trial, purging, refining seasons the last two or so months, easy, maybe more, I guess, at this point. And at first it was just like, oh man, like fire everywhere, but submitting to it because I've been down this road before, and I submit to the Lord and I receive what he's trying to do as certain things are happening. Not that they're necessarily from him, but he will use all things. See, that's the thing we have to remember. He will use all things. So shutting down what is not what is good for this, but then whatever remains, how is he refining me through this? How is he growing me through this? How is he preparing me? And so I know whatever the future holds, this time of refining and testing and trials has all been to firmly submit me into his lordship, even more into saying, not my will, but your will, God, to further sanctify me, to further press and refine and convict all those places that are not of him, that can't go where I'm going. And that's what this time has been. So just taking hold of it and letting the Lord prepare me, because he knows what I'm going to need next. And we want to be solid and deeply rooted in Christ and in the knowledge of him. So every trial, every persecution, every testing is an opportunity to grow in perseverance, endurance, and steadfastness. So what is the Lord doing in your life right now? What do you see? How do you sense that he's moving? Much love, and I'll see you next week.